Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are in the country. Thank you for joining us today. I'm just going to give everybody about 30 seconds before we kick off, just to make sure that people have had an opportunity to join. All right, let's get started. Again, thank you for joining. The topic of our webinar today is nonprofit investment policies in uncertain times. Terms of your speakers today. So, my name is Omar Vizram. I am the co-founder and CEO of Enkel. I am a CPA, CA by trade. And I'm joined today by Akash Rathan, Senior Governance Advisor here at Enkel. Akash has an impressive resume, and he is the perfect person to be talking to us about this important topic. To highlight a few pieces of his resume, Akash previously was the VP and Chief Financial Officer at BC Children's Hospital Foundation. He is currently a professor at UBC's Sauder School of Business, Langara College, and Simon Fraser University. And he is on the Finance and Audit Committee with the College of Pharmacists of British Columbia. Akash, so great to have you here today.
Thank you, Omar. Look forward to our discussion today.
Thank you. In terms of agenda, what we will be covering is where things stand today, the key issues in designing or updating your investment policy, defining an investment policy, consequences of no policy framework, what we're seeing in practice, and then we will have an opportunity for a Q&A. A little bit about Ankle before we get into the program for today. So, what we do at Ankle is we help not-for-profit organizations and charities across the country to gain clarity and confidence in their finances. We work with hundreds of not-for-profit organizations across the country. We really have two aspects to our business. One is financial operations, which includes bookkeeping and accounts payable, really all of the transaction processing throughout the year, as well as financial management support, which includes CFO advisory and controllership support. I would like to acknowledge that our offices where I'm located today are situated on the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. We're grateful to live and work on these lands and recognize our responsibility to learn from and respect the Indigenous communities whose stewardship continues today. At Ankle, we're committed to ongoing reflection and learning as part of our journey toward reconciliation. All right, Akash, over to you. Oh, you're on mute.
Great, thank you. I think I was muted there for a moment. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody, wherever you're joining from. Today, I have the pleasure to kind of talk about investment policies and taking a look at investment policy from a governance lens as well. And as I know everyone who's joined here is, I think we can all agree that definitely, cash flow is the lifeblood of any organization and particularly critical in the not-for-profit sector. And, you know, we can talk about when we were kind of brainstorming, the uncertainty in the markets and if we gave specific examples, the challenge that we would have is by the time we would talk today, everything would have probably changed as well. So it's we are absolutely in an area where we have a significant amount of uncertainty. But the thing is we've had uncertainty before. It just gets packaged in different streams. So as an example, back in 2008, I was managing an investment plan, a pension plan, and an insurance plan. And 2008, we were down, our portfolio was down about 30%, but 11 months later, we were back right where we started from. And I think a big testament to that, it wasn't as much as I'd love to take credit for it. I don't think I can take credit for it. It was really the disciplined approach that we had, which was relying on our investment policies and our investment beliefs and not just having a knee-jerk reaction. So, every not-for-profit, whether you're a charity or not a charity, there's usually some combination of revenue sources, whether that be grants, donations, and investment income. And traditionally, investment income has always been kind of that ancillary form of revenue stream that probably doesn't get the same level of exposure as the other sources of revenue. But with the changing tides in the economy, and we can kind of see that, we might be headed to an area of stagflation, which obviously from people's pocketbooks is, things are there's less discretionary dollars to go around. So just even within the not-for-profit spaces, we're going to be seeing definitely some intense competition. So with that in mind, is investment income rather than being, historically being at that low level of analysis and attention is now going to, in my opinion, probably increase for most organizations. And some in taking a look at, working with different organizations is there's really no difference between a smaller organization and a larger organization. I remember once I was at an investment manager event, and I happened to meet at that time someone who was managing money for the Canada Pension Plan, and I said, and he asked me how many assets do you manage, and I said, oh, it's really small. It's only about half a billion. And he reminded me, he said, don't ever say it's only half a billion. There's really no difference of what you do and I do is we just have more zeros. But the approach is exactly the same. There is absolutely no difference in terms of based on the size of your organization that you have. So today we're just going to be talking um, uh, about some key areas of policy design and what would be important to have in these policies. And hopefully, these would be valuable takeaways that you can kickstart some discussion and dialogue in your organization. So, as I kind of mentioned, is that example that I gave for 2008 that at one point we were down 30% and 11 months later we were back to where we started from, and it was really due to having disciplined, following our policies and executing on these policies. It is really, really easy to just kick and scream and put your hands up and say, oh, let's just sell all our assets and sit on cash or do something else, or we're going to chase the new shiny toy. And usually those reactions don't tend to pay off over the long term. So it is really, really critical to kind of go back and think about your plan. And I was seeing many organizations do this a year ago. A year ago, there was, a lot of that talk, about Canada becoming the 51st state. And then, a lot of different organizations said, oh, you know what, we're going to exit our US positions and we're just going to be in Canada. And with some clients that I was working with and dealing with saying, we may not want to necessarily do that approach. I know we're patriotic, we care about our country, but, we are stewards of these assets and we need to invest them prudently. Just to say we're going to sell our entire US exposure is really not a good reason because we have a US president in a fixed term, making specific comments. And so these are kind of the things to kind of think about. And I always like to illustrate, going back to the Canada Pension Plan, even the Canada Pension Plan that we all participate in. The Canada Pension Plan is 93% of their equity assets are outside of Canada. They only have 7% of their assets in Canada. And again, if you're asking, well, why is that? Is from their investment policy perspective, is they're trying to manage risk and they just believe that the risk can be better managed with assets outside of Canada. That's just an example of using the Canada Pension Plan. So, coming in and taking a look at exactly, well, what is an investment policy and what should it have? Is I'm going to make the assumption, then we're going to have a poll question as well, is that if you have an investment policy, I'm going to make an assumption that there was a lot of energy and time that was put into designing it. Maybe you had a third party consultant to help craft it, and it's been that same policy for years and years and years. So, at a minimum, if you have a policy, congratulations, that's fantastic. But I would definitely encourage that is your policy should be reviewed at a minimum on an annual basis. So whether these investment policies are typically board policies, and the board might delegate it to a finance committee or an audit committee, that when you take a look at the committee's work plan over a year, the review of the investment policy should absolutely be scheduled in one of these meetings to make sure that the policy is reviewed to say, hey, are things still appropriate? And the first thing that would be you'd want to take a look at whether something's appropriate or not is, well, what's the investment objective? And for some not-for-profits, you might have multiple investment objectives. You might have, for example, for a charity, you might have endowment funds, which live on for perpetuity. Well, the investment objective of those endowment funds are going to look significantly different than if you have a fund that might be drawing capital from it for 3 to 5 years. So I always say is you want to definitely tailor your investment objectives, and you don't have to just have an umbrella policy. You can do it for your specific funds. And the primary thing that you want to determine is what is your objective? If what's is your objective capital preservation? Is it long-term growth or is it liquidity? And whatever that may be in terms of priority, will kind of then design what the appropriate asset allocation would be. So as an example, if you were saying that, our number one priority is capital preservation, then a risk-based return after inflation of 3% may seem really, really reasonable because you've dictated that your capital preservation is a priority. Now, if you had prioritized long-term growth and you were getting a risk-based return of 3% after inflation, you would say, wow, we're really missing the mark here. So it is very, very important to make sure that we kind of clearly state what the investment objective is. Risk is an important component. You may have caught that I don't ever talk about returns just in absolute, saying this is a return. I use the term, what's our risk-based return? Because, for example, Omar and I could be, having a coffee, and he tells me, oh, Akash, I did great last month. I had a return of 5%. And I tell him, oh, that's great, Omar. Well, my return was only 2%. Well, we're not necessarily comparing apples to apples unless the only way those two returns can be comparable is if we take a look at it from a risk adjusted basis. And that's usually a much better measure. And these are conversations that your board and committees need to have is what's the appropriate risk tolerance? Is how much level of market volatility or potential loss is an organization willing to absorb, and understanding that there may be an extended period of pain before things turn around. And then once you kind of determine that, then you can kind of think about your asset allocations for your specific funds. And, we have the traditional ones, fixed income equities. Perhaps some of you are thinking about alternatives or have alternatives that could include infrastructure, could include real estate, could include mortgage funds, could include private credit, which right now obviously has its own challenges at the moment. But again, that's a decision after you've kind of talked about one and two. And the fourth is, of course, your time horizon is, if you have a short time horizon, then you need to make sure that your asset allocation is appropriate for that level of time horizon versus the example if you have an endowed fund, then you can obviously have the ability to take on more risk. So these are kind of the critical things that you want to have in your policy. And of course, it's not just good just having that policy in place, but really making sure it's reaching the board table on an annual basis to have that proper review and discussion to see if things are still appropriate. The other part, which I like to think about, which stems from the investment policy, is having the discussion on when to rebalance. And let's say, for example, that the investment policies all have third-party managers. As there's an investment belief, which is different than an investment policy, that active asset management over time will outperform passive management. If that is a belief, then within there is you would need to have the guidelines towards rebalancing. So let's just kind of say, for simplicity's sakes, let's just use a 60/40 traditional 60/40 portfolio. You got 60% equities, 40% fixed incomes. You might say that we will allow equities to go as high as 70%, and it will allow a lower band of, let's say, 50%. But once it hits that, we are going to force a rebalancing. And the thing about rebalancing is it's a mechanism for you to capture those unrealized gains. So you might see that the asset values of the portfolios have been steadily increasing, but you got to remember that those are just paper gains, right? You don't really have any gains until you've liquidated those gains, taken the cash, and reallocated that capital into another asset class. So this kind of allows you to capture those gains and also to allocate your assets to perhaps some other asset classes that right now are out of favor, or what we could like to say, some asset classes that are on sale. And eventually, that's what kind of, when you take that discipline of rebalancing and the power of compounding, that's what really adds the value add over time, is letting those assets compound. And it also, prevents then for just chasing returns, is, where we are inundated with information at every moment. And it's I just, for more amusement purposes than anything else, I do listen to CNBC probably for 30 minutes a day on in the car. And, depending on the markets they're doing, it's either doom or gloom, right? They can never kind of make up their mind. So I really find it's more of a comedy show than an investment show. But if you were kind of listening to some of these analysts, you would say, oh my God, okay, today Caterpillar's gone up 10%. Let me just go buy more Caterpillar, or Meta is down, so let me just sell Meta right now. So that's not the way that we want to have to be managing institutional money, because at the end of the day we have to remember, well, what's our purpose? And we would all be stewards of these assets that someone has entrusted us with, right? So it's really, really important to make sure that your investment policy is aligned with the mission of the organization. And there's certain things that you may not want that would be in direct conflict. So, as an example, if you are a not-for-profit in the healthcare sector, is you might say in your investment policy that, hey, just from a principal perspective, we don't want to be invested in tobacco, as an example. So that would seem to be that, hey, that decision is aligned with the mission, versus then just saying, hey, we'll take whatever assets there are, whatever's going to get us the return, that's what we're going to go with, which again is okay, but you just have to understand that, you know, is you may get some pushback from either board members or some of the stakeholders that you deal with or interact with on a regular basis. So we have this poll up of whether your organization has currently has a formal investment policy, and it's just a single choice.
I'll just read the question. Does your organization currently have a formal investment policy? Yes, and it's up to date. Yes, but it hasn't been reviewed in years. No, but we're working on it. No, and it's not on our radar. Let's see what you have to say. The results are in. 32% of you say yes, and it's up to date. 23% yes, but it hasn't been reviewed in years. 21% no, but we're working on it. And 23% no, and it's on our radar. So pretty evenly split, actually, which is maybe not what I expected. I don't know about you, Akash.
No, I wouldn't have guessed that. I would have thought the biggest would be yes, but it hasn't been reviewed in years. That's where, if I was gonna
Yeah.
bet, that's where I thought. So definitely
Hmm.
interesting on there.
Great.
I'm just trying to, it looks like the poll is still up there. Trying to switch the apologies. I'm just trying to flip the slide here, which doesn't seem to.
Hmm. I'm gonna try again, Akash. If not, I can hop in there.
Okay, let me. Yeah, if you want to hop in there, I don't
Yep.
know why it's not letting me do it.
I'll start sharing. Just bear with me for a second. Oh, can you stop
I
sharing?
can stop sharing, yes.
Perfect.
I guess it didn't like the poll.
Just bear with me for a second, everybody. We will be up and running in a few seconds here. Okay. Almost there. All right, sharing my screen. How is that?
Perfect.
We're in
If we
business.
can just go to the next slide there.
There we go.
Great. So as I kind of mentioned in my comments earlier, is, we all seem, if you're on this call, I think we would all agree that our day to day is kind of dealing with the next disaster, right? Like that's what we are, is we just try to navigate the next disaster and we're waiting for the next shoe to drop. And it's always, is sometimes it can get overwhelming, but we have to remember that we've been here before, right? And for those of you like, Omar's blessed, he's got lots of hair. I have no hair, and that's I is maybe that might be a function where I've just had to deal with a ton of situations where, as I mentioned, I was having to manage a portfolio for 2008, and that definitely wasn't fun. But and everyone has their own opinions, and when your boards come together, is you got to understand too is board members are also they have their own individual portfolios. They're getting information. So everyone's kind of piping it in. And our job is trying to navigate and steward to get people to focus on what's our investment policy and going back to taking a look at, okay, is it still appropriate? Are we perhaps taking too much risk? Do we want to lower that risk appetite? Those are kind of the discussions that are really, really important, not talking about, oh, well, should we be chasing the Mag 7 or should we divest out of the Mag 7? That is not helpful discussion, right? The helpful discussion is really talking about what is our investment objective and is it really appropriate? And there's like I said, there's going to be situations that are going to constantly happen as we're probably entering a period of stagflation, which is inflation and lower growth combined, so it's definitely not a very, very comfortable place to be in, but it's we definitely have been here before. And as I mentioned, is to just talk about what are the returns that we're getting. Those are really not the questions to be thinking about. Is the question you want to ask is it appropriate for the risk level that you're taking in your timeline? As I mentioned, if capital preservation was your main objective, then you can just buy a GIC, go home, you can all sleep well at night because you'll be guaranteed that 2.5, 3% return. But if you are looking for that growth in your portfolio, understanding how much risk you're taking, and in the universe of different portfolios, are you taking is that return appropriate? And where this gets usually measured is when you're trying to think about your asset mix. Is there's something called the efficient portfolio theory? Is you'd be taking a look at an efficient frontier model and making sure that your portfolio, the expected return for that level of risk is kind of appropriate, and then you kind of design there. Then once you figure out the asset buckets, then you can go and have the discussions of selecting managers. But usually some people just got to be careful that you don't want to select the manager before actually determining your asset mix, as you want to make sure you get that asset mix right. Because usually what will happen is if you select the manager first, then the manager is just going to say, well, what asset mix do you want? And then it's definitely backwards. And believe me, you know your organization better than the asset manager. The asset manager will do a good job managing the assets with the specific instructions, but you don't want it where they're having to make both decisions on there. Then that's usually where things get a little bit disjointed. We kind of move to the next slide there, Omar, please. So we got our next interactive poll.
Right. Just to read the questions, how is your organization currently responding to market volatility? One, we're sticking to our investment strategy. Two, we've moved some funds to cash or low risk assets. Three, we're not sure. We don't have a clear strategy. And four, we haven't discussed it at the board level yet. Let's see what you have to say. All right, 37% are saying we're sticking to our investment strategy. 22%, we've moved some funds to cash or low risk assets. 25%, we're not sure, we don't have a clear strategy. And 16%, we haven't discussed it at the board level yet. What do you think of those, Akash? Does
Is for
you?
those that are sticking to their investment strategy, congratulations. Like that means you're having, the proper discussions. Now, whether that pans out, only, the time will tell, but that's a fantastic place to be in. The ones that have moved funds to cash or low risk assets, I completely understand that. And these are some of the questions you need to think about. Is the shift to cash or low risk assets, was it done due to being a reactionary move? For example, hey, this is just too scary, we want to move it out. Or was it tactical that, hey, perhaps we want to hold on to some powder and or we think there's some opportunity in these low risk assets. So be quite interesting. And for the others, like, obviously, there's it can only go up from here. So I wouldn't feel too bad. Now, taking a look at investment policies in practice and just kind of, segues to my last comment is, the decision to move to cash. Was it a reactive and emotional decision, or was it a disciplined decision on there? And the policies help guide that. And there's another component as well, which I'm sure all of us can relate to, is our committee members or board members, for the most part, are on fixed terms. And sometimes what happens is you get this frequency of turnover on the committee levels and board levels, which makes it really, really difficult to try to get that historical knowledge of, hey, what was the rationale and purpose of this language in the policy? So one of the things that kind of helps with this, what I would suggest is when board members are exiting, is to do a proper offboard. And as you're bringing on new board members and perhaps new committee members, that there's a proper onboarding session and having that knowledge transfer. And usually a person in management can kind of help facilitate that. And I would find that that helps if you put in the time and effort to do a proper board onboarding. It does reduce board tension afterwards. So, someone new coming in says, "Oh, whose idea was it to have an allocation to real estate?" So, is those are kind of it helps alleviate that, and I would say it definitely reduces the tension piece. We just move forward to the next slide. So I think, hopefully I've articulated the benefits of having an investment policy, and of course, if there's any questions at any time, feel free to reach out to myself or Omar. If we move to the next slide there.
All right. So if you need help, whether you have an investment policy or you need one or have one that you need to have reviewed, please feel free to reach out to us. Following today's webinar, we will make our contact information available to you so you can go ahead and schedule a time. We'd be happy to start that conversation or help you start that conversation. We also have for you this guide that has been quite popular amongst our audience this year. And it's the 2026 Nonprofit Financial Checklist, something that really collects a lot of what's happening out there and how it's impacting not-for-profits from a finance perspective. So please feel free to download this. You can scan the QR code. If you miss it, we are also going to, of course, make this available to you after today's session. All right, let's jump into the Q&A. I will close the slide so that our faces appear larger and so that we can have a good conversation here. All right, so let me just reorganize some of these windows here. We have some questions that have come in. Here's one that we'll start with. Akash, you talked about this a little bit in terms of board member offboarding. It was on one of the later slides.
Yeah.
What kind of questions would you add to your board member offboarding in order to capture the necessary pieces there?
Yeah, no, thanks for that question. So in in offboarding, I think it's really important to gain genuine feedback, is asking that committee member. So, for example, let's say Omar's offboarding, I may ask Omar saying, "Hey, based on let's say, our meeting structures, what do you think worked well? What didn't work well? Is there some information that management was presenting that perhaps seemed a little bit confusing? Is there anything that we could bring in the future that maybe better and stuff? Do you find that we're getting good discussions, or is there groupthink?" So these are some of the clues to kind of really is Omar might have spent in given his time for the last 3 years, and rather than just giving him a parting gift and say, see you later, is to really, get some of that knowledge that what he believed worked well, what didn't work well, so that we can then incorporate that for newer members going forward. Because sometimes, people don't have meeting agendas are cramped enough that sometimes you don't get that feedback, and to invest that time just to do a little bit of an offboard can help you onboard new individuals and also make your meetings more productive and robust.
Mhm. No, that's great. Um, Earlier you talked about risk tolerance. So, when I think about my risk profile, for instance, as an investor, it's relatively low. I want to make 8% a year. I once read Warren Buffett's, rule of 72 or whatever it is, times that 72. But it's somewhat of a fluffy thing, right? Yeah, I feel comfortable buying a conglomerate like Loblaws or a bank, but I'm not comfortable investing in crypto. But these are all easier to do as an individual investor. But how does an organization go about establishing its risk profile and establishing what is acceptable, what is not? Are these things that are written down? Like, how do you bring people with potentially different points of view together to establish one risk profile for the organization?
Yeah, so it's a good question, and of course it is a lot different from an individual investor perspective versus institutional money. And this kind of again, I think is really, really important to understand, well, what's the mission of the organization, the mission and values, and making sure that, hey, what would be from there, then you can have those discussions on risk. And sometimes you have to understand that if I said, let's say if I was meeting your board and I said, if there was a 5% risk that you could be down 20% for a whole year, would you be okay with that? That would be a question, right? Like, hey, a
Right,
1 in 20 year event, if you were down 20%, would that be okay? If it was said, no,
right,
we would not be able to stomach that, is we would have some difficult conversations that we would have with stakeholders and stuff.
right,
Then, okay, perhaps that's too high. Okay, well, what's that tolerable level? If not 20, is it 15? Is it 10? And where's that sweet spot, right?
right,
Understanding
right,
then, and again, you're trying to balance that objective of growth and capital preservation,
right,
but you have to find a happy median and understand that investment does take risk. And again, it goes back to your time horizon. If your time horizon was only 3 years, then I would think your risk appetite is going to be very, very low versus
right.
if your time horizon was 20 years, then of course you have the ability to take on more.
Right. There's a follow-up question here. Is there a risk matrix to help determine the risk profile? I suspect the answer is no, but actually that's a good content idea for the ankle team. So I'll take that one offline, unless you have any comments or you know of one that exists out there, Akash.
No, I've definitely created them, but there's
Yeah,
definitely no standard.
yeah,
There's definitely no
yeah.
standard template on it.
Yeah. No, I just think like if we were to put together, like leading questions to ask, that could be useful. So thank you for that question. Here's another one. If I have a large portfolio, is there a value in splitting it between multiple advisors? What are the advantages and disadvantages to doing so?
Oh, wow. Like you must be like linked to my brain because I just had this discussion last week with a client as so to use this as this client has two Canadian equity managers. And I asked the board, what's the rationale of having two Canadian equity managers? And one of them said, oh, we want to diversify our risk. And I said, okay, that's interesting. Now, what if I told you that those two equity managers share 40% of the same names between both of them? Are you really diversifying your risk? So, and the other part too is sometimes it makes total sense having dual managers, as you might say, hey, it's a different style. So, for example, for global equities and international equities, I would think that would be appropriate on there. But for like, let's say the Canadian market, it's probably doesn't make too much sense having dual managers. And then sometimes people might put the angle saying, I'm going to hire one manager who's concentrated on growth and one manager that's on value. So you do sometimes see that where it's a different style, but of course it is the answer to that is very specific to in terms of what asset class are we referring to. So for international and global, I would think it's appropriate. On the Canadian market, I would say probably not so much.
That's helpful. Thank you. There's a lot of discussion around markets being at highs and how we've reached the top. We keep hearing that. Understandably, putting money to work is scary, right? It's one thing if you've had a portfolio that's been growing, but let's say you have money to put to work today. Um, Not that we're looking for investment advice, but what can NPOs do to make sure that they don't wake up, next month and find themselves down 20%? So what strategies can be taken to mitigate the potential that we're, at the top of the market?
Yeah, and it's a great question, and it's one that we have like discussions all the time. And Omar, taking what you talked about, the rule of 72, as Buffett would always say, buy low, sell high, repeat until rich, right? Not, buy high and sell lower. And again, this kind of ties into that risk tolerance as well, right? If for example, if you just got, imagine, picture this, let's say you had a donor or a gift where someone endowed $100 million,
Yeah.
is you're not going to just have $100 million just sitting in a savings account, right? You are going to have to deploy that cash. Now, this is where the discussions would go with the board, the donor as well, is to think about, okay, do you want to put that 100 right away into the market at time? Or you might just say, hey, is maybe we'll do a gradual draws. You know what? Every month of that 100 million is we're going to deploy, let's say, 10 million per month, right? So you're keeping things in a high interest savings account, so you're earning some interest, and you'll do a gradual draw full in. Even if markets were low, I think people would be a little hesitant to say, hey, we're going to just put the 100 million right away, right into the markets. But these are also discussions that you would definitely want with your investment advisor and the asset managers as well.
We just got a long question here. I haven't read it, so I'm reading it for the first time out loud. So, if our long-term holdings has endowment funds, which has a different objective than other funds in long-term holdings, should we outline separate investment objectives for the endowment funds versus the other funds, or come up with one objective that covers everything?
I would have separate policies. At least that's been my experience. Is I've kept separate policies on there, and even my reporting is I would show, okay, this was the performance of the endowment portfolio versus these specific benchmarks and targets that we established versus the non-endowed portfolios. So is I know it's a bit more work, but I would I would be of the camp that they should be separate policies.
Great. I have a couple of questions that actually might serve as kind of good wrap up for today. The first is, what is the process at a high level for getting your investment policy off the ground? Like, where do you start?
I think the best place would be the discussion on at the board level. I think that's where it needs to start. And so having setting the appropriate time on the agenda to talk about it, why we're doing this, and then from there, if the board decides yes, we're in agreement, we need to move this way, then usually that work would get delegated to a committee, and then the committee would work with management in putting that in. So I would definitely say the starting point is to have bring that discussion as an agenda item at the board level.
Actually, just a follow-up there before I get to the final question is, what is the board's responsibility and what is management's responsibility in all of this?
So the board's responsibility is to come up with the policy. I like to think of it as that they're outlining the rules, the size of the goalposts, and management's responsibilities to execute on that policy and to bring timely information on how the organization is performing against those policies.
That's great. Thank you. And then finally, if you have an investment policy, what does good hygiene look like on that policy? How often should you revisit it? You know, what should you be doing on, let's say, an annual basis?
I would say at least once a year. It should definitely be reviewed once a year at a minimum. And that, and you should at least have the discussion. Doesn't mean you have to change it all the time. Hey, is this asset mix still appropriate? Are the tolerance levels still appropriate? Is perhaps if you think, for example, right now, going back, if markets are at peak valuations right now, do we want to scale back the amount we're willing to be outside of the upper band? Do you want to bring that band down? So those are some of the mechanical um, and hygiene and housekeeping items that I would think are
Mhm.
critical. Of course, bigger projects, every I would say at least 3 to 5 years, you should review your asset mix again and to do an asset mix study and to see if it's still appropriate.
Excellent. All right. Well, I think that's all we have for today. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. Akash, that was a great walkthrough. Thank you very much for being here with us today. To our audience, we will be in touch with our contact information. You can feel free to reach out to us. We'd be happy to talk to you, whether it's designing a new investment policy or updating the old one. We'd be happy to chat with you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.